In this podcast, what I want to do is basically go over the reality that, especially in most folks are prone to this, but especially Americans have no sense of historical depth. And so it's very important for us to understand, especially if you're looking at things like interior design, it's very much in the here and now. It's interesting when you talk to interior designers, you ask them what interior design was, say in 1950 or the post-World War II period, and many of them will look at you blankly. There's a fairly large, part of architectural history, but that's usually, of course, is of major, fancy sort of architectural digest type spaces, like Ealing Palace, for example, not normal homes. That British series that you're watching one of is a good example of the difficulty that they had, and something I thought was actually going to be interesting when you look at the first episode, which you guys don't have to watch, is they thought it was going to be very easy to basically go back and make, reconstruct an apartment from 1900 Edwardian England, urban, suburban environment. They didn't really, the BBC and then the architects thought it was going to be easy. They had a hell of a hard time. I was involved briefly in some of the work that the National Park Service was doing in terms of what are oftentimes called ghost towns in the West, and reconstructing even a one tent shelter that a miner was living in terms of what would be in that shelter in, say, 1880 or 1840. You not only weren't sure, but in many cases you had no clue. And yet these are in our own societies, and they're not that long ago. Yeah, they're 3 or 4 generations, but these are, societies which pride themselves on writing and recording stuff. We have almost no idea. We have very little idea of what you would have found, for example, in a private home here in Hawaii in, say, 1920 and places like Kaimuki. Those places still exist. The structures are there. Some of the major features like the plumbing and stuff are still there. But in terms of how people actually use those space and what you found in that space, it's really hard. That's why when they do the plantation home reconstructions, for museums and stuff, that takes a tremendous amount of research. And even then, a large proportion of sort of like, well, this is what we think. And so and the reason that becomes a big issue is because things have changed so much. And so what I want to do in this presentation is go back and look at how things have changed over time in American society. Now, we're not going back to the cows. So I only want to get back to that. That's just a whole nother, level of detail we don't need to get into. But if we just take, for example, 1860, or if you want to, 1880. So basically the Civil War, slightly post-Civil War period, this is when America was expanding across the continent. So this is when America sort of started to define itself. And this is where American lifestyles became uniquely different than their European counterparts. At least that's sort of the stereotype. And then what you also get then is we're going to then contrast that to sort of 2020s in the sense of things sort of the here and now. But a lot of these distinctions are really, really large. And again, your Gallagher book actually has a fair amount of this, but I just want to reiterate some of this. One is that traditionally in American society, right up to the 20th century, people in power lived on the ground floor. Servants lived upstairs. I think there was a real famous British sort of soap opera drama TV series called Upstairs, Downstairs, or something like that way back in the day. But the reason for that, very simple, is that masters or people in charge weren't going to have to walk up and down stairs. Now, that also was the idea that one of the implicit aspects of this was back in the 19th century, Americans, like their European counterparts, tended to do a lot more interaction in what would now be considered the home. So the living area, especially hallways and living areas, as we'll see when we get into furniture, were actually considered semi-public space. People dropping off your mail opened your front door and put your mail inside the hallway. People dropping off milk or delivering goods put them in your hallway. People were going to come over to say hi, came into your hallway and then knocked on the door to the living room. So it's oftentimes, maybe the third level of private space in the 21st century. Back in the 19th century was actually semi-public. And so the folks that owned the house, the folks whose house it was, would be on the ground floor because they were the ones that were going to socialize. If you were a servant or something like that, then you would be upstairs. One, because you weren't supposed to be seen or heard unless you were being used. And secondly, you didn't have any reason to socialize in the house. It wasn't your house. So wealth and prosperity were ground floor things, not upstairs. And that included things like bedrooms. All the stuff would be downstairs if you're the folks in charge. Cooking areas and bathrooms were external. It's important to remember that plumbing didn't exist until the late 19th century, and for much of the United States, early 20th century. Much of Europe didn't get internal plumbing until after World War II. This is why if you go to some places like Paris or other cities like Lyon or something like that in France, you'll frequently find that bathrooms are actually at the end of a hallway if it's a bunch of apartments, and that's because they actually put in the bathrooms much more recently, way after the time the building was put in. Prior to that, it was what usually called chamber pots, and I'll let you Google that to see what they look like. So people just did their business, and then they would go and take it and dump it. But you have to remember in Europe in Europe until the late 19th century, in Asia till the 1920s or 30s, in the United States till the 1880s, when you were done doing what we normally do in the bathroom, you just dumped it outside, which is one reason why, contagious diseases were such a huge issue. And so bathrooms were, if there was a bathroom, it was usually a hole in the ground, what's called an outhouse. And it was intentionally outside the house because otherwise it wasn't going to smell at the house because it didn't flush it. What was there just stayed there. Cooking areas were usually external to the house worldwide. And that very simply is the fact that cooking was done with fire. And most homes in most of the world had wood and stuff like that and were flammable. So cooking areas, kitchens, whatever you might call them, were always catching fire. And so you had to make sure that the cooking area was actually physically separate from the house. So if it went up in flames, you didn't lose the whole house. So that was just sort of practicality. And also you have to remember, you don't have plumbing, you don't have moving water. So water being carried in buckets, for example, is how you did your cooking. So again, having it separate from the house just meant you weren't tracking water through the house. In America into the 1920s, pretty much, this change starts around 1900, 1910. The whole family slept in one bed. And in fact, it was considered very strange for even teenagers to want to sleep in a separate area, because the general question would be, why don't you trust sleeping with your parents? And so the idea that you had a family sleeping area was normative until the early 20th century. I'm not sure. There was a whole moral crusade that went on when they started having bathrooms and cleanliness. And cleanliness very quickly sort of spun off having separate bed areas, especially for kids over the age of maybe 6 or something like that. I have never bothered to look into it. I'm sure there's someone that's written a book on it somewhere. Feel free to go look for it. But basically, in the mid 19th century, everyone slept in the same bed. Now, in many ways, like we saw when we looked in Japan, this was just a practical necessity. Unlike Asia, which you didn't have central heating, you generally would have heating in a wall, either a fireplace or what was oftentimes called like a Franklin stove, in other words, a standalone stove. So you had one spot generating heat, but it was very inefficient, much less efficient, ironically, than its Asian counterpart. But what this also meant is that you were going to, could easily freeze to death if you were sleeping out in the main area. So the family slept together just so they could collectively stay warm. So it was just sort of practical necessity until the late 19th, early 20th century. But it was also a very strong moral component. The family that slept together would live together. And so if you tried to segregate, especially sexes and age, that was sort of implying that there was something that you were worried about. So, if you had separate beds, people would wonder what was going on, that you felt you had to have, physically separated space. So sort of the opposite of today, where if the whole family slept together, people are probably wondering, why are you doing that? Again, as I mentioned just a second ago, your hallways and the steps outside were actually public space. You still see this a little bit. And if you remember earlier, when we were looking at American households, the idea of the porch. In American society, right into the 1940s, 1950s, the porch was public space. People could walk into your yard. It was never fenced. If it was fenced, it was decorative and the gate was always open. And you would socialize and interact with people. They'd come and sit on the porch and you'd talk story. And so that was considered public space. It wasn't considered private space. And frequently, the hallway leading from the porch would also be considered at least semi-public space, as I mentioned earlier. So the idea that you basically would have a modern fence and a, warning, attack dog inside, and, this is my private area, was not part of American society. It was just the opposite. And you sort of see that if you go back and look at the Williamsburg purchase, because if you notice in the Williamsburg, you don't see any defined area between, you don't see porches, but you don't see a defined area between the street. You have a fence, but that's, it's not a functional fence. And then bam, you have the front door. So porches were part of Americans' manifestation of being social. If you didn't have a porch, if you didn't have an area where you could sit outside, in the shade or protected from weather, then it was sort of implying that you didn't trust in like your neighbors. And there would probably be a huge push for you to do something to fix that. So having semi-public space for you to interact with people going by was a normative thing, and it was expected. And if you were building a house, you'd see it. So if you go back to the Sears prefab homes of the early 20th century, 20s and 30s, invariably there will be a porch. And of course, you still see this here if you go to little neighborhoods like Kaimoki and Kalihi and stuff like that. The older homes from the 30s and even the 40s had porches. In many cases, they've now been enclosed, but originally they were built with a porch because you had to have a porch. It was an area of social public space. Yards were functional. They might have some grass in them, but generally they were not for that function. They were for putting things, they were for social interaction, they were for play areas for kids. They served a bunch of different purposes. And they were never, don't touch this. So there's certainly not what you see, for example, in Kahala today, where yards are artistic, aesthetic objects. They're not for use at all. This certainly was not the system back even into the, say, mid-20th century in the United States. And again, where this sort of fit into the Hawaiian system was that the lanai was the equivalent of a porch, which is one reason why here in Hawaii, people probably very quickly sort of moved into the Western style structures because you still had social spots. In the traditional Hawaiian hale, you have a gravel or paved area in front, which was your porch. But in many ways, an American style porch had the advantage that it was generally covered in shade, had pieces of furniture like a stereotypic rocking chair, whatever. And so in some ways, there's just a more comfortable version of the lanai. So people very quickly sort of bought into that, sort of design feature. It's sort of interesting as lanais became enclosed, especially in neighborhoods like I used to live in Kalihi and also in Kaimoki. You needed the floor space as the family expanded, so you would actually enclose the lanai. So as you expand sleeping area or whatever, then the lanai moves to the carport outside. So that was the normative public space right into, I would argue, pretty much the development of the modern subdivision in the 1940s with Levittown, where this gets completely redefined. Now we look at the modern thing, what we see is that privatized space moves upstairs. For one thing, servants generally aren't in people's homes now. Servants might be a Roomba, for example. But your privatized space is upstairs. And oftentimes more expensive space might be upstairs, actually. Bathrooms are all inside, cooking areas are inside, they're privatized. A huge issue from the 1990s on that was very popular in American design, I'm not sure if it still is, was the idea of the absolutely massive bathroom. Massive him and her bathrooms that are, I can't remember what the technical term is, but they're actually attached to the master bedroom, oftentimes with huge walk-in closets. So you have this enormous amount of interior floor space devoted to basically going to the bathroom, taking a shower or a bath, and then storing clothes. Again, it was a major part of American design, even in sort of middle class homes. I assume it's still going on. I just, to be honest, haven't checked the last couple of years. The idea of the open plan kitchen living area, where cooking now becomes not only as part of the social area, but also cooking becomes part of the social interaction. And cooking also becomes oftentimes a display. One of the things that's really interesting if you go into something like Amazon or anything like that is the number of appliances that you see in American kitchens, many of which are pretty seriously expensive. And again, this sort of takes this whole idea of commoditization and consumerism into what just used to be food preparation. It's also because in many ways, food preparation has become less gender specific. Very typically, this is actually still true of a lot of ethnic groups. If you look at traditional Italian or sort of my background, Mexican families, you'll find that traditionally when the family gets together, the women in the family go into the kitchen, which actually is intentionally blocked off in the sense that it's a separate area. And that's where the women hang out and the guys hang out in the living area or someplace like that. And so you still have a lot of gender segregation. It's also very typical, even today in Hawaiian Polynesian design, you'll see families in a normal home. The women will congregate in the cooking area, food preparation area, and then guys will be out maybe in the carport, living area, whatever. So this idea of physical space separation by gender, I think is this sort of, well, I think a certain intentionality in American society, the idea that you shouldn't have cooking be a gender specific, female specific task, the idea that you open up the cooking so that people that are doing food preparation or whatever are actually part of the interaction, so they're not actually segregated. But I think this probably has at least has as much to do with the fact that it now allows you to use the kitchen as a display of technical expertise and actual toys, the sense of appliances. The idea that you now have the front door locked, I think it's Amazon or whoever has the doorbells that you can watch things coming in, that you have multiple locks frequently on doors, that the hallways disappeared, the door now leads into the living room, but the doorway is in fact outside of the doorway. You could argue that the outside barrier of the yard is now the start of private space, and the front door is even more privatized. So no one's allowed in the house, basically. And then one of the classic ways you see this is then the semi-public space, which used to be the front yard, has now moved and been privatized and moved to the backyard. So this whole idea of trespassing, of privatized space, is now expanded tremendously from what would have been part of the interior to not only the whole interior, but actually parts of the exterior that are privately owned, if you want to think of it that way. Yards, as I mentioned a second ago, have become moral displays. They're very expensive. You have gardeners if you live here in Kahala or someplace like that. Even in Kaimoki, frequently people use gardeners. And this is so that you don't use the yard. The yard's for a display of either your wealth or your industry. So you go and you weed it and you mow it and you trim the hedges and plant the plants. And again, this is one of the largest industries in the United States related to homes, is the maintenance, upkeep, and modification of yards and lawns. And of course, the ultimate example of this in the American system is the lawns of morality tale. In many areas of the United States, most subdivisions, for example, it's certainly true in Kapolei, is that if you don't keep your lawn up, you might own that property, but if you don't keep your lawn up, your neighbors can actually protest whatever the organization that runs that subdivision or whatever it is. And if worse comes to worse in much of the United States, the community and city or whatever organization runs it can actually condemn your property and take your property away because you didn't keep your lawn up. There were some issues about 5-10 years ago in Kaimoki, where there were two homes where basically there's just huge amounts of stuff in the private, within the property boundaries, but it was just, piles of garbage or piles of stuff. And eventually the city condemned the properties and took all the stuff out. And one of the main reasons was you weren't following the moral code for how a neighborhood's supposed to look, even though it's technically a private space, which is sort of an interesting conundrum in American society. The public input into private space is something I don't think Americans really think about much till they end up on the wrong side of it. I would argue in American society, the porch has vanished as a function. The porch is oftentimes still a part of a house. They'll oftentimes have one or two rocking chairs or some other furniture, but it's very rarely used. It's basically a display piece, just like the lawn in front of it. Almost all the exterior social interaction will happen in the backyard, which is considered there the family can relax. They're not on display. So this idea that the public is displayed, and much closer to, say, the Japanese norm, is very much part of American society in the 21st century. But I would argue right into the 1940s, 1950s, it wasn't. And in many ways, in American society, we still have this illusion of the porch where you sit down after work and you rock in the rocking chair and have a beer and say hi to the neighbors and talk story. We still have that stereotype, but we don't use it that way, which I think is a fascinating sort of measure of the changes within American society. We don't tend to think about very much because we still, in many cases, want a porch. We still furnish the porch with furniture, but we very rarely actually use it. Very much task specialized space, individual bedrooms, individual bathrooms. Each bedroom should have its own bathroom. Home offices. I went through this sort of before. So this idea that you have task specialized space. What's really sort of interesting about this is if you look at the last 10 years would be the growth of tablets, first laptops, then tablets, and now, of course, smartphones, would be that what you find is task specialized space can be done in an open area. So you can have a family sitting down on couch and chairs in an area where it's designed for interaction, but they're paying no attention to each other because they're all on their device. You see this, all of you see this anytime you're at school, or especially if you go to a restaurant. You see four people sitting in a restaurant at a table, and it's designed to interact with each other, but they're all on their phones and they're paying no attention to each other. So I think that what's really interesting is this social space for family interaction has basically dissolved as technology has changed, how we interact with the world around us. And what you see as part of this then are areas that have totally disappeared. I would argue the living room really doesn't serve that function anymore. I'm not sure what to call it. Maybe social space area or something. But the dining room is completely gone. In many American homes, that's the room that's vanishing. If you look at a 1940s floor plan and you look at a 2025 floor plan, to find that one of the huge striking differences is the massive area that used to be defined for dining rooms, it's now gone. In large part because dining rooms were not used that much. I mean, traditionally, I suppose back in the 19th century, they were because you everyone dined together at a table. By the 20th century, people would have an area where people did their casual dining. The dining room was more for formal displays. So you'd have a large dining table, a lot of chairs, and you'd use it for maybe, Christmas or family affairs or something like that, where people came over. So it was a social space for formal events. And this is one reason why I think if you go to places like Inspiration or other interior design places, you're going to find not a lot of dining tables for sale anymore. And if you go to places that sell used furniture, dining rooms, dining tables, and dining chairs are one of the main things that they have to deal with because, people just don't use them anymore. They're not comfortable. They're too large. What do you do with that? There's better use for that huge amount of space. And so all the ancillary furniture along with that we'll see when I look at this next time also disappeared. So what's really interesting about this is American homes have gone through enormous changes certainly in the last 100 years, last 150 years, but even since the 1940s, so say the last 60 years, if you look at an American home design or the way that, for example, early subdivisions, post-World War II subdivisions were advertised to Americans in the 40s and 50s, you'll find radical differences between, subdivisions marketed to folks saying Copley or Eva in the 2020s. I'm not going to bother going over the lawn stuff too much. It's insane, and it's a peculiarly American thing. It's a huge source of pollution. It's a huge source of resource use. It's a huge source of unnecessary water use. The stat right there, 50 to 70% of the water we use, this is certainly true here in Oahu, is used for landscaping. It's not used for washing. It's not used for bathing. It's not used for drinking. It's for landscaping. And that's residential. We're not talking hotels or tourism, fountains and stuff like that. This is literally people in their homes in Kapolei or Mililani or whatever. The last and probably the most striking in some ways, and I haven't really seen a good study of this, there's probably someone working on one, has been the absolute dominance of car space in the last 60 to 80 years. If you go back to when we were doing that tour and we were looking at subdivisions in the American landscapes bit a couple of weeks ago, and you notice how once the car shows up very quickly, the car becomes a major part of social interaction. The main street very quickly starts to become sort of pushed and defined by the car, to the extent that one reason Main Street's probably disappears because you can't put a lot of cars in. And so what happens is more and more the car, rather than being a transportation device that's ancillary to living, becomes actually part of the living area. And I think in part, especially post-World War II, what happens is in the United States, it moves from having ownership of an automobile, which is a necessity in terms of transportation and functionality, and it moves to the car as status. And so the brand of car, the cost of the car, the style of the car, more and more becomes a major statement in terms of people's success and image in the community. So just like the lawn or the size of the house or anything like that, we mentioned this before, the car becomes one, if not the major statement of style and status for Americans. Now, what that means, among other things, is if you've got two drivers in the house, then you're going to have two cars because everyone has their own idea of what they want. And because we're a very individualistic society, people are going to want their own car, not only for mobility purposes, but also for sort of statements of status, prestige, and statements of who I am. And so what happens is more and more the car moves from functionality to basically style and social dynamics, if you want to think of it that way. Now, what happens though is the amount of space that people spend in terms of the lots of their homes doesn't really increase, especially from the 1960s to the 1990s. So as people start to have 2 cars, or in many cases 3 cars, the size of the lot they're going to put all this on, because it also includes the house, is not going to increase. And so what happens is the amount of space given away to yards, for example, shrinks. But even more importantly, what happens is you find that the total, square footage under a roof starts to shift from a living area being the main area with the car garage being ancillary. Is more and more you find that the living area can become shrunken and the car area, the garage area, becomes larger. And very typical on the mainland to see 2.5, or oftentimes called 2.5 or 3 car garages. And yet the homes are actually not that large. And the yards have pretty much shrunken to almost nothing. So what you've got is this covered space to store automobiles, or at least hypothetically automobiles, now becomes, a much greater part of the investment that people have when they purchase a place. What you also find then is if you start to add in the paved area, those cars to access, to park, to whatever, this again becomes a huge part of the actual floor space. This is the spot where the front yard disappears into paved areas for cars, the driveway. And so what happens is the car, which originally is just a design element, almost like a piece of furniture, more and more becomes a central part of the design logic of the home, of the apartment. And this, in the modern context, the 2020s, cars have become absolutely central to the design of space, in the sense that people will sacrifice living areas for themselves to have areas for the car. Now, they might not actually have the car inside. One of the paradoxes that you see is the idea is while the garage is actually grown in space, there's an increasing remodification of the garage into other types of recreational space or something. So maybe it's just changing in some areas of, some types of living areas, but nonetheless, it's designed as for the, pure purpose of car storage. And so one of the side effects of this, you see this a lot in American subdivisions, and you see this if you go to Lowe's or Home Depot or any place, is garage doors, which of course used to be a way just to keep the weather off of the automobile, now become major style statements. So it's all sorts of garage doors, and they can get incredibly expensive to make a statement, which in many cases is more ostentatious than the house it's attached to. This is especially true of prefab homes, where you find the prefab home is not that striking, but the garage door will sometimes be stunning in terms of how it's laid out and what it's supposed to be. Fascinating example of how Americans are pacing their money, which of course reflects the importance of things in the world around them, and especially things that they consider that they own.